Alright, so last week we got to learn all about the different data types in Python, including numbers, such as integers and floating points with decimals, letters, also known as strings, and Boolean data types, which could be either true or false. This week we get to learn all about lists. The list is another data type in Python. Basically, it is a list of values. Every value can be a different data type if needed. But typically they're all of one type in most cases. So a list is just a nice handy way to group values together that are grouped. For instance, you have a list of names in your context, right? Those are all, you don't want to have an individual variable name for each one, so you create a list which allows you to have as many or as few as needed, and you still only need one variable name. So very powerful, very handy. Now one thing, something that you absolutely need to know for list types is how to access and modify each individual element. So as you can see here, I've got a list of integers, and I store it into a variable called numbers. So every time I want to access something inside this list, whether I want to read a value, write a value, add a value, remove a value, whatever I want to do to this list, I need to know the name of the list. In this case, it's numbers. On that note, typically a list of values will be a plural noun: numbers, names, cars, so on and so forth. So to declare a list, you basically you create a you start out with the square bracket, opening square bracket, and you just put in all your values separated by commas. Okay, you don't have to have a space between them. I like a space between them just because it's easier to read, but it's not necessary. And then you close it off with the ending square bracket. So that now is a list of values. Excuse me. To access anything inside this list, I just need to know its name, and then I use the square brackets, and I tell it which element in that list using a number. Okay, so element 1, element 2, and so on and so forth. Now, something that's very important to understand with lists in Python is that they always start at 0. So in this case, the first element in the list is not 1, but it's numbers at position 0, right? That'll return the value of 4 because that is the first element at the 0 position. This is called an index. Okay, so the 0 index points to the value of 4. Okay, the 1 index points to the value of 56. The 2 index, well, ironically, points to the value of 2, and so on and so forth. The very last index is then the size of the list minus 1. Okay, so in this case I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 values in the list, so the very final value can be referenced using the length, which is 8, minus 1, so 7. So numbers 7 will return the very last element in this list. Okay, so that's pretty much, and then in that case, so if I want to modify the value, I can just do something like this, right? So now if I run this code, it is going to take the value at index number 2 in the list of numbers, so 0, 1, 2. It's going to change this value of 2 to the value of 54, right? And vice versa, I can print that value. It's going to find this variable, find index number 2, and then print the value for me. Okay, so that's kind of how you use a list in Python. So let's look at some of the examples for this week that you need to complete. All right, so the first one was this list sum, right? The Codio is passing in a list of numbers, and your job is to add up all the numbers, add up all the elements, and then output the results. Okay, so here's our list. I'm not sure exactly what Codio is going to give you, so I'm going to just create one here for the demonstration. All right, now, since you are going to add up all the elements in a list, that's a pretty good sign that you're going to need some kind of a total variable, right? Whenever you're doing a sum of elements, typically you want to start at 0. If you're going to be multiplying elements, you want to start at 1, typically, and that can change depending on the requirements. In this case, since we want to add everything up, we're going to start at 0. So set our total equal to 0. Now what we need to do is loop through the list. Okay, for, and they call it elements, so I'm just going to shorten that. I'm going to say for element in numbers. Okay, so what this does is it creates this for loop, and it's going to create this, I'm creating a variable here, and it's going to go through each element inside this list of numbers. Okay, and then it's going to start it out at the first value, and it's going to successively continue moving it along. Okay, so element on the first iteration is going to be equal to 4, the second iteration is going to be 56, 2, 44, and so on. So all I need to do is add the value that elem is assigned to at the time to the total. Okay, so I'm going to do total equals total plus elem. That's as simple as that. So now as soon as it finishes up this loop, total is going to have the sum of the entire list. It's as simple as that. Alright, now to print it all out, at the very end, I want to decrease my indent here, because right now where the cursor is blinking, that is still inside the for loop. So if I type out print total, what this is going to do is each iteration it's going to print the total. I don't want to do that. I want to print it only after the loop is completed, right? So in this case, I'm just going to move this over once. Now it is outside of the for loop. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That goes into the tabbing and the format of Python. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So if you watch down here at the bottom, here's our output, 190. I trust that if you want to verify that, you can throw that into a calculator and you'll see that the value is 190. Okay. Moving on, we've got number 3.2. This is populate a new list. So we provide you with a number n, create a list, then populate the list with n elements. Set each element to the index multiplied by 10. Okay. So create a list with n elements. So we're going to use the range function, and then we're going to have it go all the way up to n. So let's see here. They provide me with a number n. I'm going to go ahead and just create a value here. We're going to do 5. Let's see. Create a list. All right. So I'm going to say my list. I'm going to set it to an empty list, and that can be done with just opening square bracket and close square bracket with nothing in the middle. That is just an empty list. Now you can add to it. You can't index anything or access anything in it because there's nothing there, but you can add to it. And that's what we're going to do. So now we're going to, for I in range, oops, forgot to spell, up to n. Alright, remember back when we discussed the range, if you only supply one element or one number inside the range parentheses, it defaults to 0 as the starting element and then goes up to, but does not include n. And whether you include n or not can be important, but in this case we're not going to do it. So let's see, set each element to the index. Alright, so what we're going to do is for each iteration we want to add to my list. So we're going to do my list, and then the list type has a function called append, which just means add to the end. And we're going to add the index value, which starts out, it's going to be this variable I. You can call this whatever you want. I like to use I. Alright, so we're going to add to the list I times 10, because we want to set each element to the index multiplied by 10. Okay? I'll put an element starting at 0, counting by 2. So this was just kind of a translation of what was provided. So what this should do is when it starts out at 0, it's going to add 0 times 10, which is 0. Then it's going to do 1 times 10, 2 times 10, 3 times 10, all the way up to this value. Okay. Now we don't need to include n, so we don't have to do n plus 1, because then instead of a list populating a list with n elements, it'll be n plus 1 elements, right? So we don't want to do that. We just want n elements. Alright, now I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure they just want you to print that at the end. I'm not sure the exact value or what the exact expected output is, but this is kind of how I would do it. You just print the list that you created. Alright, next one here. So I hope that makes sense. Oh, let's go ahead and run this too and see what happens. Right? Let's run it. And here we get 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, just like we expected. And it does not do 50 because the n here Since the range does not include the n, it stops at 4. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, last one I'm going to do right now is the 3.3 short strings. Create your own array of strings. Now they use the word array here. Array is just it's the same thing as a list. Basically, it's just an array of objects. So in this case, you can call the array anything you'd like. Array, you can change that to list if you want, as long as it's a valid variable name. You should know how to name variables. List should contain 3 elements, the first being all A's, the second being B's, the third being C's. So that should be simple enough. We're just going to create a list, my list. And remember, you use the square brackets for that. And then we just want to add an element of AAA. You need a comma in the middle, and BBB, and CCC. And that's it. So now my list is created. We print it, and that should be done. Let's run it and see what happens. AAA, BBB, CCC. All right, it prints it just like it was how I declared it. All right. So I hope that makes sense. That's a few quick examples on using a list in Python.